We're here with Rosemary Thornton, and she has had a really interesting near-death experience she will share with us today.
I have written a bunch of books, and I had written, I guess, 7 or 8 books at that time. And I actually met my husband in 2006, and we were married about a few months after we had first met. But I had enjoyed some success as a writer. I had written for a local newspaper, and then I wrote for websites and wrote for magazines and even wrote ad copy for a time. So I had enjoyed some commercial success, as much success as a writer can have. And then I wrote some books about architectural history, and the books did well. And I was featured on some pretty impressive television shows, which was great fun, great fun. And then I met my husband, who was a professional in his own right. And so I thought we had a good meeting of the minds, as Virginia Woolf said about her husband. So I was, people thought of me as strong and capable and independent and all those good qualities. And I really thought my husband was the love of my life. I married him when I was, I guess, 45 or 46. And I guess I was 46 actually. We were married about 10 years. And then one day he came home from work and ended his life. And I was beyond devastated. And the thing about him blaming me, to clarify that a bit, it is so common, so incredibly common. I've subsequently learned, pardon me, for people who take their own life to engage somebody in an argument shortly before they do it. Usually it's the person to whom they are closest. It seems to be a way for them to kind of ramp up to a point where they can do this awful thing. So it's very common. I mean, somebody who takes their own life is in a very dark place, to say the least, and they are willing and happy to lash out. So the people who leave behind a tender, thoughtful note saying, "I'm sorry, this isn't your fault," I don't think their numbers are great. I think I know there are a lot of stories like my husband's. So he was obviously in a very dark place to do this. After he ended his own life, I lost my mind. I became pretty messed up in the head, to say the least. And there was a time I couldn't get comfortable anywhere. Of course, I left the house. I couldn't be in that house anymore. And different, very kind friends tried to take me in, but nobody knew how to handle me. I had been this successful, strong, interesting woman, and now I was a mess, just a hot mess. And for a time, I found, in very, very short time, just a couple days or 3 days, I was decided it'd be best to just stay in my car. So I was living out of my car, and a friend found out about that, and she was adamant that I come home with her. And I said, "I'm not doing that." But my friend, her name's Tracy, she intervened and she said, "You're not living in that car. I want you to come home one night. It's better than sleeping in the car." I said, "Tracy, that's probably not a good idea." But she talked me into it. So one day turned into 4 months, and that helped me get past the worst of it. And then I ended up living with a friend who helped take care of me for about a year. And then I was finally able to be on my own. And I thought I was doing pretty well. I had 3 prayers I prayed every night. One was I asked God, either heal me or let me die. I knew I could not stay in this betwixt and between state of misery. My second prayer was I had suffered severe decision fatigue. As again, so typical. There were a lot of legal messes left behind by my husband's death. And I had to consult with lawyers and throw money at problems and had to make some very difficult decisions. So I asked God, help me with these decisions. I can't face it anymore. And then the third prayer was I had always been a fan of books about near-death experiences. And I knew a common theme was a life review. So I asked God, and these were 3 prayers I prayed every night, spare me the life review. I had suffered for 29 months of just hell. When I closed my eyes, I saw my husband killing himself again. I saw what he looked like. I just couldn't bear it anymore. So I thought, I've been through that once. I don't want to go through it again. So then after 29 months, I had some very disturbing physical symptoms. I went to a doctor, and the doctor said, "Well, you've got cancer, and it's advanced to a point I can see it upon physical examination." And a bunch of tests were done, and it was affirmed I had stage 2 cervical cancer. And then from there, I was referred to a oncologist who did a biopsy to see how far this had spread. And it was because of the biopsy, surgical biopsy. I mean, I was anesthetized. after that, I woke up and I realized I was bleeding profusely. And despite the fact that I was bleeding profusely, the hospital sent me home in that state. And from then I went home for a bit and realized it was just getting worse. I remember being at home. I was actually standing in my shower because I didn't want to make a mess of, all over the floor because it's just bleeding everywhere. And I remember standing in the shower and thinking, I've been praying a lot. There's a Bible verse, First Corinthians 10:13. It says, God will show you a way out. I thought, I've been asking God to either heal me or let me die. Maybe bleeding to death is my way out. And I thought about that a lot as I stood in that shower. And then I thought, a lot of people put a lot of effort into saving my life. Maybe that's not fair to them for me just to die now. So anyway, I stepped out of the shower and my friends were still in the living room and I had them ask them to get me to a hospital. And I was taken by ambulance in the hospital, actually an ER. They made some more mistakes. And then ultimately I ended up on a gurney in a little ER cubicle with a nurse holding my hand. And I was pretty distressed, to say the least. Plus, when you bleed out like that, you actually have even more anxiety because your brain is losing its blood supply. And so anxiety is a common side effect and confusion of bleeding to death. And I was in that state. Anyway, I grabbed the nurse's hand. I said, promise me you're not going to let me die. And she said, oh, honey, we have many solutions for this. I thought, well, okay. But then they gave me a shot of a painkiller, a very powerful morphine-based painkiller, and they left the room. And I was there in the room with a friend, but it was just the two of us, no medical personnel. And he said that he was watching my blood pressure because they had a little machine hooked up that was automatically monitoring my blood pressure. He said he looked up at one point and the blood pressure read 33/25, which means you're pretty much dead. And he said he was getting ready to get up and summon some help. And he said, I opened my eyes and I had been unconscious at this point, but he said, you opened your eyes and he said, you reached your arms straight up to heaven. He said, you even wiggled your fingers like a child reaching for a parent to pick them up. And he said, you talked to somebody that only you could see. And he said, and then you dropped your hands back by your side. And he said, and then the blood pressure gauge went to error, which meant it was lower than 32/25. And meanwhile, I was having the time of my life. I was having a great time. I mean, the last thing I remember was them putting that drug into the IV, and I passed out pretty quickly. And the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake. It was very profound. It was like being awakened from a deep, dark, dreamless sleep. And I was jolted awake by being catapulted out of my body. Very, very dramatic. It wasn't some gentle lifting out. It was like a ping. In fact, in Mary Neal, she wrote in her book, she had an NDE after a drowning accident. She talked about this ping that you hear when the soul leaves the body. And she likened it to the sound a stone makes when it's dropped into water. And I thought that's a good description, but I heard that noise. And meanwhile, I'm floating further and further away from my body and thoroughly enjoying it. And the very first words out of my mouth in this new experience were, my heart has stopped. And I thought, how do I know that? And I thought, I don't know how I know that, but I know that's right. And I was like, wow. And then, I've been a writer a long time. My next comment to myself, and I'm talking out loud, having lived alone for a time, and I had a dog for years. I'm very good at talking to myself and or allegedly talking to the dog, but I was talking out loud as distinctly and physically as I am now. It's quite something. But my next comment was, actually, you're not dying, you're dead. Because when you're going on to your reward, correcting your tense is the most important thing, or so I reasoned. And I thought it was funny, and I laughed out loud, and I heard myself laugh, and I thought, that's pretty funny. And I heard myself giggle. And I was pretty interested in that too, because I thought, I don't have breath sounds, pretty sure I don't have lungs, pretty sure I don't have vocal cords. And yet not only am I producing sound, but I'm hearing sound. And I was also immensely comforted by the fact that I was still me. I'm still making goofball comments. I'm still making comments that are probably borderline macabre during my own death process. And I was so comforted to know that every single thing we are, down to our funny little giggle, goes with us. I just found that comforting, that I had left nothing behind on that gurney. In fact, I remember thinking, what did I leave behind? What's back on that body? And I thought, that's an easy question. It's anxiety, fear, worry, woe, guilt, regret, sadness, self-recrimination. That's what I left behind. Everything I really am went with me. And that was just such almost an epiphany, such a powerful realization. And, we talk about the fact there is no death, and there really is no death. I mean, the people back in, I guess on this plane of existence would certainly be missing me, but I didn't experience anything akin to a cessation of anything except those negative attributes. And, one side note, I mentioned this in my book, one side note that I found pretty compelling. Throughout this experience, I heard somebody screaming over and over again, probably 35 to 40 times. I heard somebody screaming, Rosemary, over and over again. And it was feeling was that it was behind me. And when somebody screams your name, heck, I can't even go into a grocery store and hear a kid scream mom without spinning around and think, who's that? Somebody's calling me. But to hear your name screamed like that and not respond, I realized in retrospect it's pretty interesting. But the fact of it was, I wasn't Rosemary anymore. That name had no connection to me. It was just a word. And in fact, that noise, that Rosemary, Rosemary, was more akin to the sound an alarm clock makes when you're trying to sleep, like a boop, boop, that you just wish would quit. It was actually a little bit annoying to hear that. But that's how disconnected I was from that experience, and so quickly. I mean, my name's been Rosemary for 60 years. That's how I've identified. So I thought that was pretty cool. And turned out, in retrospect, it turned out to be the nurse, that while they were trying to resuscitate me, she was calling my name, a couple times a minute for a long time, apparently. So I'm still floating away from my body, and I'm thinking, my whole life I've been reading about near-death experiences, and now I'm having one, and and I didn't categorize it as a near-death experience. I thought I had always wondered what it'd be like to die, and now it's happening. And I had zero intention of going back. I mean, absolutely zero. In fact, I remember thinking, I'm so grateful it's over. My whole life, or for many decades, I've kept a daily list of 5 things for which I'm grateful. And even through the day, when you do that for years and years, you tend to think, oh, I got through that grocery store line very quickly and the cashier smiled at me. That's something for which I'm grateful. And even in this experience of dying, I kept thinking, I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful it's over. The doctor had already set up a chemotherapy schedule and a radiation schedule. And I thought, I'm not going to have to worry about that. I'm grateful about that too. In fact, I remember thinking this felt a lot like being granted early release for good behavior. It really did. I felt like I had gotten out of something I wanted out of badly. So I was so profoundly grateful. And, honestly, as deaths go, my experience had not been bad. There'd been a lot of fear, but there hadn't been much pain. And once you start to bleed out, you just get tired. I did have the anxiety, but you just get tired. You get tired and sleepy. So this went on. And at some point, early on, after I said, actually, you're not dying, you're dead, which that was really funny, I felt a massive spiritual being with me. And this being was much taller than me. And I'm still floating away from my body. But this being is right close to me and to my left and slightly behind me. And I remember turning my head slightly to the left and trying to look up. And I thought, that's pretty interesting that I'm turning to look over my left shoulder. I'm turning my head to look over my left shoulder. And I thought, so I still have some sort of humanesque form here. But as I did that, I'm very happy that this being has joined me. And I said, literally with a smile, I said, and who are you? And the answer was immediate. I didn't even finish the short question. The answer was, you, Rosemary. But it was, you are the image and likeness. I'm the original. Well, that's Genesis 1:26. We're made in the image and likeness of God. And I thought, the original. And I had studied that Bible verse for so many years, and now I felt like I understood what it meant to be made in the image and likeness of God, because it really did come with an infusion of understanding. And, I still have, I mean, it's been 5 years now. I still have hard days, days where I cry, days where things don't go the way I think they ought to go. But when I see the word the original, and in advertising, I've noticed the word the original appears on a lot of stuff. There's a popular juice brand that calls itself the original. And I have some shoes. The other day I was putting on shoes to go to a fancy event. I looked down at the shoes and it said the original. But I cannot see the word the original anymore without remembering that there is an original and I'm but the image and likeness. So I was busy thinking, whoa, you're the image and likeness, I'm the original. And I was still pretty in awe of that comment as I'm continuing to float away from my body. And one of the thoughts I had, another very powerful thought, I thought, because I'm floating away in blackness. And a lot of people talk about the love they feel. I did feel love, but the predominant feeling I felt was peace. And as somebody who's always struggled with anxiety, that's heaven to me, to just have perfect peace. And a Bible verse came to my thought. The peace of God that passeth all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. And that's Paul who wrote that in the New Testament. And I thought, this is the peace he was talking about. You can't explain it. You can't help anybody else understand it, but it's perfect. It's perfect peace. And it passes all understanding, passes anything we could ever say or do or think or explain. And I also thought it was really cool that I remembered all these Bible verses and I remembered my life. I remembered the nice fireman who came to the house to help me get on, get into the ambulance and go to the hospital. I remembered everything. And I thought, this is great. Everything I am not only goes with me, but stays with me. I get to carry these experiences with me. So it was all very profound. And it went on and on and on. One of the things that happened was I remember thinking, I've been in this blackness before. Like I've had this experience in conscious memory, or it's not conscious, but unconscious memory before. And at this point, I had a spiritual being, not the big one, but just a spiritual being keeping me company as I floated away. And I asked this being, how is it I have this feeling that this is something I've done before? And the being said, well, remember your mom explained to you that when you were a baby, an infant, newborn, you were given up for dead. And she said, and then you had a remarkable healing and non-medical. My mom prayed for me after she'd been told I was all but dead. And the angel said, you crossed over then and you came back. And that explained to me, I mean, ever since I was a kid, I felt so strongly. There's an old African American spiritual that says, the earth is not my home, I'm just a passing through. And I felt that. I've always felt that ever since childhood, that this is not my home. This is like a temporary base camp that we kind of have to go through this to go on to the next experience. And I have felt that so deeply. And, even when I was a kid, I would see angels. I would know stuff that people didn't know. Like I remember very distinctly a beloved aunt passed on. And I called somebody and I said, Aunt Susie has passed on. And they said, how do you know that? I said, well, she came to say goodbye. I'd been praying for her. And she came to thank me for my prayers. And she said, I'll be leaving now. And she passed on. And I had a lot of those experiences. And it helped me understand that those were not anomalies, but they were part of this thing of having been to heaven and gone back once. So, and I had always felt like such an oddball on this earth, And if I could sum up all of this in 3 words, the experience of dying and being in heaven and floating away from my body, it would be that the people that really, really, really love me, the beings, they surrounded me as I was floating away and they said, kind of the equivalent of welcome home, dearie. They were all so happy to see me. And they never thought of me as an oddball, They never looked at me and said she's an oddball. They thought of me as somebody just wonderful and unique and good and full of light. They just really, really liked me. And I wish we could all have that experience all the time, And I don't know how long this floating went on, but it was quite an experience. Honestly, the whole experience I had, if I had to say, I would have guessed it lasted for hours. And yet, in fact, I was gone less than 10 minutes. And then I was taken, I don't remember the transition. Last thing I remember is floating. And then the next thing I knew, I was in a white room. And I don't remember how I went from the floating to being in this white room. I mean, I'm still dead per se, but in this white room, the whole room was filled with this perfect white light. And yet the room had like a mist all through it, but it was perfect white. And it was just me and the angels. But I saw this mist, and it wasn't just falling, but it was floating and swirling and dancing around me. And I asked the angel that was with me, I said, what is this mist? I feel like I ought to be able to focus on an individual droplet. And the angel says, well, your new eyes have not acclimated. Your spiritual eyes have not acclimated to this yet. But what you're seeing are particles of light. And they said it's akin to a spiritual car wash. That some people die so heavily impressed with some disease process or problem from earth, they think it's part of their identity. And the point of the spiritual car wash, or all this light, is to restore us to our inherent and innate wholeness as a child of God. And somewhere in this experience, I was told that if I agreed to go back to earth, I would be restored to wholeness, that I had been restored to wholeness. I thought, okay, cool. I'm not going back, but cool. And I saw a door in front of me, and I knew what that door was from having read all these NDEs. I knew exactly what that door was. I knew that that meant we were crossing the line of demarcation. That once I got to that door, I'd be out. I'd be done. I couldn't wait to get to that door. I was very excited about it. It seemed like it's maybe 15 feet in front of me. So I got to the door and I put my right hand up. The door was shut, which I remember thinking that door should be open. But I put my right hand up to push through the door. Pretty interested by the fact that right-handed on earth and right-handed in heaven. I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. Still dominant right-handed, you know? And as I did, I paused and I said, is this the divine will for my life? And I couldn't even get the whole sentence out. And the answer was immediate. The answer was no, it's not. That a medical mistake sends me on. But the answer also was, but whatever you decide, go back, go forward, you go with all of God's blessings and mercy and grace and care and love. And I thought, I'll take that deal. So I decided to go forward and go through the door because I was done. I was done with this life. And as I did that, I had a vision of that nurse who had comforted me so. And in that vision, she was sitting in a hospital supply room, surrounded by medical supplies and stuff, sitting on a little metal stool, leaning forward, head in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. And she said, I promised that woman I wasn't going to let her die, and I lost her. And I thought, well, you know, she's a nurse. She's about my age. She's been through this a time or two. She'll get over it. And then I thought, yeah, I need to go. I can't stick around here. So I again decided to push through the door, but then I didn't just have a vision of that nurse. I was shown the pain she would have, the grief, the sadness, just the profound regret that she had made this promise and then failed. And I felt that pain. It's like it hit me right in the solar plexus, you know? And I thought, if I can spare one person that much pain, I have to go back. So I put my hand down, and the second I put my hand down, you know, the hand that had been reaching for the door, second I put that hand down, I was back in my body. And I was back on that gurney in that little hospital ER. I was pretty disappointed to find myself back in that little hospital ER. I remember looking up at the ceiling, and I saw an angel in the upper left-hand corner of the ceiling of this hospital room. And by angel, I mean, it's kind of just like a sparkly ball of light. And I looked up there at her, and yes, my impression was it was a she. And I said, we didn't talk about this, you know, Robert's Rules of Order. We had a first, but we didn't have a second, and we didn't have a discussion phase. And I was actually pretty miffed because I said to this angel, I said, do you know how much energy it takes to die? And the angel was not impressed. And in fact, one thing I've learned is angels often don't respond to your questions. After I said this, the angel just kind of looked at me and said, hi there. You know, like, noted, not an issue.
Wow.
So I was taken by ambulance to a larger hospital, one hopefully that had a trauma center. And as I was being loaded into the ambulance, well, you know, backing up very briefly, I thought it was pretty interesting. They couldn't wait to get me out of that ER after they got me resuscitated. I'm pretty confident they thought I was going to die again on them. And the ambulance drivers were also very concerned that I was going to die on them. At this point, I had an oxygen mask on. And my friend, who'd been chased out of the room once they realized I had died, my friend said that when they wheeled me out of the room and put me on the gurney to put me in the back of an ambulance, he said, "You've heard the expression white as a sheet, but you've never seen human skin that white." He said, "But you were that white." And my friend had been a Vietnam era medic, so he knew something about seeing people in rough states. But he said, "Your skin was white as a sheet." And he said, "Yet you had dark blue circles under your eyes and your lips." He said, "Your lips were absolutely dark blue." He said, "You looked worse than a corpse." So, everyone apparently was looking at me and thinking, can she make it to the hospital? But anyway, I was taken by ambulance. And as they're letting me into the ambulance, I remember thinking, my whole life I've been fascinated by NDEs, and now I've had one. And I thought, it wasn't like the ones I've read about. I didn't have a tunnel. I didn't have a field of wildflowers. I didn't have all the typical experiences. I just had this thing of floating away from the body, being taken to a white room, having some discussion with the angels in the white room, and then seeing this nurse. It was a vision. And by the way, people have asked me, was that a concurrent event? Was that something happening right then? I said, no, my impression is it was a potential future event, seeing that nurse mourning my death. So I was taken by ambulance to a hospital, and while I was in the back of that hospital, the back of the ambulance was absolutely filled with the presence of another angel. And she kept telling me these funny, funny stories. And just as we're driving down the road, she would just talk about the other drivers, and she would talk about being in an ambulance and how I was always so fun to be with. And it was so fun. And I kept taking the oxygen mask off my face so I could laugh better, because I was laughing and laughing and laughing at all these things the angel was saying. And that angel, the ambulance driver, I'm sorry, the attendant in the back with me, at one point, he took that oxygen mask and he popped it back on my face and he said, "You have got to stop taking that oxygen mask off." I thought that was pretty interesting. So at the hospital, I was in the hospital for several days. And to me, one of the best parts of the whole story was that I was on total bed rest for a time because I had bled to death. And by the way, it was medically documented and affirmed the first morning when a doctor came in to visit me. And it's interesting, when you bleed to death and are resuscitated, then you get the doctors that are seasoned and older, have some age on them. But he said, "You suffered a massive heart attack last night and your heart stopped." And I said, "Well, not me. I'm very healthy. I bike, I walk, I do a lot of things to stay healthy." And he said, "No, your heart did stop." He said, he said they had done blood work and it showed some sort of enzyme was way elevated, and that by morning it had already started to come back down. So he said, "We know it's not underlying heart disease, but it was in fact a heart attack." And he said, "And your heart went into VFib, which apparently is when it just quivers." And he said, "And then it stopped." So when those first words I heard were, "Your heart has stopped," that was right. That was accurate. So I was in that hospital for 4 days. And when my friends would sit with me, when you're in a kind of compromised state, it's a good idea to have friends with you to make sure somebody doesn't come in to take you away for a, kidney transplant or something. So when my friends had to step out to get a drink of water or go get a bite to eat, the angels would come to my bedside, and little angels, visible, physical angels, would surround my bedside and sing to me. And they sang me songs about praising God. And the songs were so beautiful. I would just lie there and cry. And I would say, "Don't stop. It's almost too much to take in. It's like putting 100,000 amps through a 60 amp breaker." It was just almost too much to take in. And I said to them, "This is so powerful and so beautiful." And I said, I want to remember it. I'm good with houses, which is my background in architecture. I said, "Not so much melodies and music." And they said, "This is not for you to remember. This is for your healing. This is for your peace. This is for your joy." And they very clearly said, "This is a thank you for agreeing to come back." And I thought, wow. And they sang these songs glorifying God, and they were draped in these garments of light. And the more they sang these songs praising God, the brighter and more sparkly these garments of light became. It's like everything that praised God just made them brighter and shinier and prettier. And I mean, I've told this story, as you and I discussed briefly, I've told this story many times in many venues, and I've written about it. I wrote the book 2 or 3 years ago now. And yet every time I think about those angels singing to me, it makes me very emotional because it was a profound experience. So I was discharged from the hospital. I didn't want to leave the hospital. You know, they bring you food 3 times a day in the hospital. And if you say, hey, I'll take an apple juice, you have an apple juice brought to you immediately. It's great. I didn't want to leave, but then the elder doctor came in to sit with me. He said, Rosemary, it's time for you to go home. I said, but I'm still not moving very well. I'm still very weak from, having died 4 days earlier. And he said, well, your blood cell count, your white blood cell count is so terribly low. He said, you're at grave risk of opportunistic infection. And he said, if you get an infection, he said, we won't be able to save you. He said, that's why you need to go home. You're going to be safer at home. So I agreed to go home. And I was told that it would take 2 to 3 months because apparently it's the bone marrow that regenerates blood. And it would take 2 to 3 months for the bone marrow to successfully regenerate the blood to where the breathlessness would stop, the risk of infection would be diminished, and all that other stuff. He said, so for 2 to 3 months, you need to take it easy, really easy. And in fact, they said for 2 weeks, I'd need somebody in the house, 24-hour care. Actually, they discharged me to a convalescent center, which, nothing good about that. And I said, what if I have 24-hour care? And he said, if you have 24-hour care, you can go home. That'll be okay. So I went home and I had a follow-up doctor appointment 2 weeks later. And at the follow-up doctor appointment, they did a lot of blood work. And the doctor came out and talked to me. And at this point, I had a female doctor, and she said, there's a mistake with your blood work. And I said, well, what's the mistake? She said, well, your numbers are textbook perfect. She said, it's impossible for what you've been through for them to be down to the decimal point, textbook perfect. I said, no, that's right. I'm back to riding my bike, slowly. I said, and walking. I feel the breathlessness is gone. I feel okay now. And she just shook her head. And then the other thing, the bigger thing that happened, obviously, was it took some effort, and I had to find another doctor. But ultimately, there was another surgical biopsy per my request. And it was affirmed that every vestige, every trace of the cancer was gone. And not only was the cancer completely gone, but the surgeon who did the surgery, and there was lots and lots of taking of flesh or whatever, what do they call it, and checking it all kinds of different ways. But the surgeon said that my flesh was so pink and pretty and perfect. She would not believe I ever had cancer, or had she not seen the test previously. So it was a very dramatic healing. And like I said, that's been almost 5 years ago now. And I was so grateful, that I didn't have to go through any of the anticipated traditional and harsh cancer treatments. But the bigger healing was the healing of my soul. I had been a mess after my husband's death. And something the angels told me was they said what he did was real bad and it inflicted a massive spiritual wound on you. They said, but all that, the word they used was encapsulated. All the darkness, all the bad, all the stuff associated with that suicide had been encapsulated. And yes, it was a thing, and it was real bad, but it couldn't hurt me anymore. It wouldn't cause me any more pain. And the reason that word encapsulated meant so much to me was, as an architectural historian, when a contaminant is found present in an older building, it's now considered wiser to encapsulate it rather than attempt its removal. Sometimes in attempting the removal of a contaminant or a hazardous material, you actually spread it through the building. You make it worse. So I love that analogy. The angel said that all the darkness and sadness and pain affiliated with this very dark act had been encapsulated. And so shortly after my caretakers had gone home, and it was about 2 weeks out, I plopped down on the floor with my Bible, and I was laying on my tummy reading the Bible, and it fell open to the 23rd Psalm. And it's like this one line was illuminated, and it said, he restoreth my soul. And I thought, that's the real healing. I'm so grateful to be healed of a physical disease, but it was the restoration of my soul that was the real healing. And that's something only God can do, to have your soul cleansed, made whole, restored. And after this, I sold off everything I owned, and I saved a few things, but not a lot, and got rid of pretty much everything. And I sold my house, I sold my car. And then I moved 1,000 miles due west to the Midwest to start a new life. Because, and this is still true, I'm in Virginia in the middle of a farm area right now, visiting some very dear friends. And I look out the windows and I like watching the peanuts grow. I just love watching things grow. Corn and peanuts and soybean and all that stuff. There's just something about watching stuff grow that brings me inestimable delight. And that has remained for these 5 years. And when I get sad or depressed or feels like things aren't going well, I still like to just go sit by a farm field and watch things grow. And the other thing I love is watching, like, when the combine comes through the field and harvests stuff. I find that very exciting. So this experience had a whole lot of effect on me. In fact, I met a neuroscientist that drove from a nearby state. She was about 2 or 300 miles away. She drove to meet me and have dinner with me. And she said, the most profound part of your near-death experience to me is not that you had these remarkable healings, which they were remarkable, but she said the most profound aspect of it is that you came back a different person. Human beings do not change that quickly. They change by degree, and they change slowly, incrementally. She said, you came back so different, and then selling off all your stuff and moving 1,000 miles away so I can be surrounded by cornfields, which is true. That's what I did. She said, that's not a typical experience. She said, that's what makes your story the most believable to me. And the reason I love it, I mean, I have shared this story a lot. I've written a book and, I get a lot of feedback, a lot of email. By the way, my website is temporarydeath.com. I don't like to call it near death because I wasn't near death. I died and came back. But I do get a lot of emails from people, which I do enjoy. But I still think about, not a day of my life goes by that I don't think about some facet of this experience. Like I mentioned, the original, I still, whenever I see the words the original, I don't think about what it means to be original. I think about, oh yeah, you're the image and likeness. I'm the original. There's so many facets of it that still are kind of percolating in thought.
You were quite religious before you had your experience because you were quoting the Bible. What do you feel now about religion, about your spirituality?
Unfortunately, in society, the word religion has been given such a negative name, negative, I guess, impression. I had a daily habit of reading the Bible, and I read Bible commentaries. I loved learning about the Bible. And I loved that when I died, I still had all those memories. I still had all those Bible verses so close at hand. So I would say that part of me didn't change. But if anything, after my husband's suicide, I lost a lot of my faith because I had been praying for my husband ever since I met him. I had been praying every day for him. And to have this happen was very devastating. And when you've leaned on God your whole life and then you feel like it was a joke, that you were wrong, you really are rudderless. You really don't know what to do. And so I really struggled with my faith after this happened. Like, how is this man I love so much got taken out? I didn't understand that. So what happened in this experience of dying and coming back, it actually just kind of reaffirmed that, yeah, there is a God. And one of the takeaways from this, I grew up with a dad who was very unkind and very harsh to me. And so I could never think of God as father. I could think of God as mother, and there are some biblical references that quote God in motherly ways, but I could never think of God as father because I thought you had to earn a father's love. It was never granted, and it didn't come easy. It was a high threshold for attaining a father's love, and I never got there. When I was 14, my dad left and never came back. So, but this experience introduced me to a God that is feminine and masculine, has both qualities, the tenderness of mother and the strength of a father. But the big thing was that I learned about a God who really, 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 really likes me. that, we know God loves us, but to meet a God that really, really, really liked me. And God wasn't saying, if you could just get your grades up, if you could just get that book to the New York Times bestseller list, if you could just not have gone through that divorce years ago, if you could have just blah, 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 blah. But that God says, as is today, right where you are, so flawed, so many dumb things I might have done. And God still says, I really like you.
Wow,
That's
that's
what I
great.
remember.
You said you turned your head to take a look at him. Did you ever get to see him?
I did not. I was in this perfect blackness, and the kind of blackness, in the woods, when you put your hand in front of your face at night, you can't tell if it's there or not. I was floating away in this perfect blackness. So I didn't see my body. I didn't see this entity, this being, but her presence was so, so powerful, so strong.
Okay, tell me some more about this blackness, because I have heard different testimonies about this dark place where you cannot see anything, not even if you put your hands right next to your face. I experienced that in a NDE-like experience, and I came to think that people call it the void. So it's something that people apparently go through when they have both near-death experiences or these out-of-body experiences that take you to this place that is completely dark, and that contrast.
Yeah, it's interesting from what I can glean about, well, who knows what percentage, but some of the time people float away from their body and they see their body and they see stuff. But another significant percentage of time people experience this blackness. And the blackness, I heard another writer call it velvety blackness. And I thought, boy, that's a good description. But to me, it was like comfort as a verb. The blackness was not just an essence, but it was like actively infusing me with comfort, and the best comfort in the world. C.S. Lewis said, we are half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and food, when like a child entertained in the slums by a mud puddle, there is actually something like there is a infinite joy awaiting us, like a holiday by the seashore. And that's what this was like. That he was right. We are half-hearted creatures. We're fooling around with food and drink and sex and all the typical hedonistic physical pleasures, when in fact, God's saying, hey, why don't you stop playing with the mud puddles in the slum? I have a holiday by the seashore for you. It was so, I think the biggest thing, Daniel Brinkley had this quote, he was one of the famous NDEers. He had a quote that he was told, we are powerful spiritual beings. And I think that's right. And I think we tend to, we just are so self-limiting. And we just need to see that we each are powerful spiritual beings. And I guess that's one thing I've awakened to since coming back from this. I keep a list on my phone, don't have my phone with me, but I keep a list on my phone of daily miracles. And I call miracles, I think it was Einstein. Somebody said miracles or coincidences are miracles where God chooses to remain anonymous, which I love that. And I've had so many, but one of them was one day I was just driving down the road in my little car, and I thought, I feel so lonely. I'm so tired of being lonely, And I said, God, please send me a sign that, I'm not as alone as I feel right now. And I was just sitting at a stoplight with my hands on the wheel, just praying, God, send me a sign. I'm just so struggling with this. And I opened my eyes and there was a pickup truck pulled up to my right. It was actually a commercial truck pulled up to my right and had a bumper sticker, and it just said, you are not alone.
Wow, that's great. It was Einstein said, live your life as if nothing is a miracle or as if everything is a miracle.
Everything's a miracle, right?
You went from this complete darkness to this white room. This is a pretty big contrast. Why do you call it a white room? Were there walls, or was this only empty white space?
I would say it was a room. I would say it had walls, ceilings, and floors. And I remember, the frustrating thing, and I tell people, it's like somebody took my batteries out because I don't remember going from the blackness to the white room. I don't remember somebody saying, "Hey, we're headed here now." I just remember being in this white room. I'm like, "Oh, sweet." And I saw that door in front of me. And I remember thinking that if I perambulate with intention, I can get to that door, because I remember thinking, I don't know if I have legs. I don't know how this works, but I know I see the door. I want to be at the door. So I will perambulate with intention. And I thought it was pretty funny that I picked the word perambulate.
But when you reached that door, you said you raised your hand. Was there a physical hand? What did you see? Then you said you lowered your hand.
I did. And I've had this, I felt the substance and presence of my hand, but I didn't see it. I guess it wasn't in my field of vision. But yeah, if I could redo this experience, which I think I get one more time and then that's out, there'll be no coming back. I wish I would have looked at my hands, look at my feet, but I didn't think to do that. So I don't know. I do remember thinking the door should be open, and I went to push on it to open it.
You said you saw several of these beings that you call angels, but when you came back, you continued seeing them, and you also said that you looked at them and they seemed physical. What did they look like?
The ones that surrounded the hospital bed, and sang to me, I mean, they were more real than any human I've ever encountered. This was not some hallucination, because this happened repeatedly. When my people would leave the room, the angels would just appear and they would sing to me. It's like they were saying, "You're not alone," because I've always had this thing about being alone. I do struggle with loneliness. And plus, being in a hospital is kind of scary business. They were tall. They were maybe 6.5 feet tall, and they were draped in these garments. They had a humanesque form. They had head, shoulders, and torso, and they were draped in these gowns. And the gowns were like gathered around their neck, but then just flowed. But they weren't gowns. The gowns were made of energy. The gowns were made of light, but it was movable light. It was like just sparkles. And the more they sang, the brighter the sparkles got. They were just sparkles in their head. They didn't have eyes, nose, and a mouth. They just were like so bright. You couldn't even look at their face, but you knew they had, again, a humanesque form. And I didn't stare at them. I just felt their presence, and I guess I glanced at them. I mean, they were all around the bed on all three sides of the bed. And they sang to me. And these songs they sang in perfect harmony, and it was so beautiful. But the big thing I remember was their gowns were made of light. And the more they praised God, the brighter those lights got.
Did you ever see them again?
No. After I left the hospital, I didn't see them again.
Not even in dreams?
I do feel the presence of angels still. I hear them more than I see them, but I do feel their presence. And I talk to them a lot, and ask them to keep me pointed in the right direction. That's one of my daily prayers, is asking God just that I always stay pointed in the right direction, to not make a foolish turn.
Tell me about your book. What was the purpose of writing it?
I didn't want to write this book. At this point of my life, I had written 9 books. 9 is a good number. I didn't want to write another book, had zero interest in that whatsoever. Writing is hard. Dorothy Parker, an author from years ago, she said, "I hate writing. I love having written." And I think that's pretty true for most writers. But what happened, I was giving this talk live. This was before COVID. I gave this very talk, to a live audience in Virginia. And afterwards, a woman stood up and she said, "Have you written a book about this?" And I said, "Nope, and I'm not going to." And she said, "I wish you would reconsider." Because there was a story about my interaction with some medical staff that she said, "That story is so shocking. It really needs to be shared with a much larger audience so that we'll know how to deal with people like you." Because in American psychiatric care, there really isn't a place for people who are mentally healthy and go through a severe trauma and need help, support, and healing. There really isn't a place for people like me. And the thing that happened shortly after my husband killed himself, I lost the ability to eat or drink. I mean, my throat just locked up. My daughter took me to an urgent care kind of place. And at the urgent care, the doctor came into the room and said, "Hey, ladies, what's the problem?" And my daughter said, "Well, my mom, she can't eat or drink, can't swallow, nothing." She said her husband killed himself and she's got to start eating. And the doctor, a man about my age, I remember, a nice looking man with gray hair, he literally went back like this and he said, "Oh my God, oh my gosh. The same thing happened to my Aunt Bertha and she was never right in the head again." And my daughter, to her credit, she looked at him and she said, "Doctor, that is not helpful. Are you going to be able to help my mother or not?" And he immediately regained his professionalism. But that's the thing. We don't know how to deal with people who've been through severe trauma. We just don't know. So this woman in the audience said, "You got to write a book." And I said, "I don't want to." And she said, "You really should." So I did. I reluctantly wrote the book. And I guess it took me about 3 years to write because I wanted it to be precise and right. And I kept rewriting because I was like, yeah, this isn't saying what I want to say.
What do you hope people can take away from your story?
That's a really excellent question. I guess the takeaway is that I want people to know when they lose a loved one that that person's still having a heck of a time. They're having a good experience. I was talking with a friend who has also had an NDE, and she said, anytime we go to a funeral, we look at the guy in the coffin in the front of the church and we think, "You lucky duck, I know where you are. I know what you're experiencing, and I envy you." So I guess the takeaway is realizing when somebody dies, there is no death. They still have their funny little giggle. They still have their goofball sense of humor. Everything they are went with them. Everything. The word personality comes from the Latin word for mask. When you die, it's like the mask finally falls away and you are who God intended you to be. So the takeaway is it's when you lose someone, yeah, it's lonely. You miss them. You wish you could give them another hug, but boy, they're having a good time.
What would you tell someone who has just lost a loved one or who has a terminal illness and is thinking a lot about death or maybe is afraid? What would you tell them? Because you mentioned that death does not exist. And I think that would be a great title for this video.
What would I tell them? I actually gave a talk publicly several weeks ago, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "Doctor says I got about 6 months to live, and I don't want to be frightened." And she said, "Can you really promise me that I don't need to be afraid of what comes next?" And I said, "Yes, I can promise you that." Because the thing about my story that I hope, a lot of people say, "Oh, when you die, it's just the brain shutting down. It's the sparks of neural firings and all that crap." But the thing about my story is when I died, I had cancer. When I came back, it was gone. That and also the spiritual healing, the spiritual aspect, that was not the brain shutting down. And that's a medically documented thing. So what I would say to somebody who's at the jumping off place is probably what I say to the guy in the box at the front of the church during a funeral is, it's going to be good. I know it feels very daunting and frightening right now, but you're going to see, it's like waking up. It really is like waking up from a very intense dream. It's like this whole thing is a really intense dream. And when you die, you're like, whoa, that felt real when it was happening. And I remember thinking when I was floating away from my body, I was thinking I'd been alive 59 years at that point. And I remember thinking, not really a big deal. I was so busy thinking of all the stupid things I did when I was 50, through my 59 years, mistakes I made, wrong turns I made, dumb things I did. I was like, wasn't that big a deal. And it was over so fast. 59 years gone like that. It was amazing how and it's like this whole time on earth is reduced to this little tiny bit, like a grain of salt that says, yep, you did it, you learned, you moved on, it's gone, not a big deal.
Wow, that's great. I think your story is really interesting, Rosemary, and I'm really glad we had this chance to talk. I am going to ask you to talk again in a few months. Maybe we can, I will try to read your book completely. I started reading it, but I'm not finished, so I will have more questions.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.